On to our first major speaker, Terry Sejnowski has been involved in neuroscience and has been one of the earliest influencers and collaborators with Geoffrey Hinton's career. He's also very prominent in your field. He's the president of the Neuroinformation Processing Systems Foundation. This oversees that machine learning conference that is one of the biggest in the world. He's professor and director of the Computational Neurobiology Laboratory at the Salk Institute in California and is a distinguished professor at UC San Diego. Terry?
Thank you very much for that introduction. One small correction. NeurIPS is the largest machine learning conference in the world. This December, we're going to have 14,000 people in Vancouver. And it's been growing exponentially ever since 2012. Let me first initialize my slides here and tell you that there are going to be two parts to the talk. The first part is going to be to take you back to the early days of neural networks back in the 1980s, give you a feeling of what it was like to be there. It was a very exciting time. And I had the privilege of collaborating with Jeff during those early years. Could we have the first slide, please? Oh, it came out. Okay. No, it's okay. I think it's going to catch now. The cord was not connected. Who needs slides? And the second half is going to be about a research project in my lab, which I was really, it was a fantastically interesting project, as you'll see in reinforcement learning. So, very good. So going back even further, this is now at the earliest days of artificial intelligence, 1956 famous meeting at Dartmouth. Well, at the same time that AI was going off in the symbol processing direction, Frank Rosenblatt at Cornell had this idea of what he called a perceptron, which was, it was actually not a model of a neural network, it was a model of a single neuron. That is to say, it had one output, had a lot of inputs, and it had weights, and that's a very simple model of a neuron. And what was really important, though, and this is really critically important for our field today, was that he was able to prove a convergence theorem. That is, he was able to show that if you have enough examples, and if there was a set of weights that could discriminate between two classes of inputs, that his learning algorithm, the perceptron learning algorithm, is guaranteed to find a solution. So that really is a very powerful theorem. Of course, you know, it was taken perhaps too literally. If you look at the New York Times article that came out at the same time that he was given the Navy gave him $100,000, equivalent of $1 million, to build an analog perceptron. And it says here, the Navy revealed the embryo of an electronic computer today that it expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, that's a pretty good trick, and be conscious of its existence. So, I mean, hype was not invented here, but it's clearly promising a lot from one neuron. Now, the bubble was burst in 1969, as we all know. Minsky and Papert published a book. It was a treatise on computational geometry. And what they proved was that perceptrons could only learn very simple predicates, first-order predicates, which means a surface through the high-dimensional space. Now, if you look at the cover, one of the things they proved was that perceptron cannot distinguish whether an image like the top and the bottom are connected or not. That is to say, one object or two objects. So how many people here think that the circles at the top, right, the helices there, are connected or not? How many? Put your hand if you think they're connected. 1. I don't think people are very convinced about this. Okay, so that means everybody thinks this one's connected right on the bottom. Okay, well, the answer is it's almost impossible to tell without using your finger. I'm not going to go through this, except to say that what this illustrates, ironically, is that perceptrons are really bad at something that humans are very bad at. Now, back in the 80s, here's an argument that was used for why what we were trying to do was impossible. Okay, Minsky and Papert, everybody knew that they had done this analysis, and at the very end they said, we doubt whether there's a generalization to a multi-layer perceptron, and everybody believed it. And people in AI were going on their merry way, writing programs, trying to solve difficult problems. And here's the argument they used why it would be not very relevant to look at the brain, which, by the way, is the only existence proof that you can actually solve the problem. But here's the argument. The argument is, if you want to build an airplane, you're wasting your time studying flapping wings of birds or what feathers are made from. Very convincing argument. Well, there's a biography by David McCulloch that came out a few years ago. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, where he actually did some research. And here's the truth about the Wright brothers. Well, first of all, they spent a lot of time studying how birds glide. Why? Because they use very little energy and were able to stay up for very long periods of time. That's what they wanted to do. Number 2, they were inspired by the wings, the airfoils, and thought that the principles of aerodynamics might be important. And so they built a wind tunnel. And they collected data. And so, their approach was very scientific, and it was based on engineering, and they were inspired by biology. Not the details, but rather the general principles. And the same thing turned out to be true for artificial intelligence. In 1979, Jeff and Jim Anderson organized a workshop at UC San Diego. They invited me. I was, at the time, a postdoc. And this was really an interesting workshop. A small group of people from who were the pioneers in neural networks, including Teuvo Kohonen, Stu Gieman. This was really Jerry Feldman. There's about 10 or 12 of us. But we all only had one thing in common, because everybody was working on a different approach. The only thing in common was that none of these approaches worked in the real world, which, of course, the same thing was true for a lot of the work that was being done in AI. And it was during this time that Jeff and I got together and really had the view that, look, general principles from the brain are massively parallel, highly interconnected, and the most important principle that we took away from the brain was learning. That rather than program, if you could learn from examples, then this would be a big win. Now, unfortunately, at the time, computers were still very slow. They were getting faster. They were fast enough so we could simulate some of our networks. And in particular, during that period in the early 80s, we came up with this concept of the Boltzmann machine, which was inspired by John Hopfield's associative memory network. Very nonlinear form of an interconnected set of units. And what we did, we took the Hopfield network, we heated it up, and we used it to find the global minimum. But something magical happened, and this is all physics. When you come to equilibrium at a constant temperature, there's a learning algorithm that allows you to learn from examples. And this was for arbitrary interconnected network, recurrent, with arbitrary number of hidden layers. Of course, at the time, we couldn't simulate that many hidden layers, but in principle, the Boltzmann learning algorithm proved that Minsky and Papert were wrong. And it was during that time when Jeffrey moved to Carnegie Mellon University. I moved to Johns Hopkins University. And we were very excited. We thought for sure this is how the brain works. Why? Because in order to be able to learn the connection strengths, you had to have two phases. You had to have a phase when it was clamped to the inputs and outputs, and another phase where it was free. We called that sleep. Also, and this is still true, you didn't need a global signal. You can compute every piece of information you needed statistically locally between every pre- and postsynaptic weight locally, just by looking at the correlations in these two phases. Now, it was during this time that Jeff was asked to give a talk at MIT. And when he arrived, he was surprised to hear they had a tradition. Tradition was that he wasn't actually going to give the talk. Somebody else, it was a cognitive science group, was going to give it for him about his research. And so poor Jeff had to sit there while Steve Coslin, a psychologist who knows nothing about the Boltzmann machine and even less about physics, had to give his talk. And you can imagine how he squirmed. But that was the tradition. And it was about the same time that we organized a summer school at Carnegie Mellon. This is in 1986. And I think, let's see if I can point out some of the people here. So that's me. Here's Jeff. Here's Jay McClellan. Okay, now let's do Where's Waldo? Where is Jan LeCun? Can you see how many people here? Put up your hand if you've identified Jan LeCun. Okay, I'll show you. There's Jan. Okay, where is Michael Jordan? Okay, we have a hand. He sticks out like a sore thumb, doesn't he? Yes, there's Michael. And in fact, a lot of the famous people who made important contributions to that era and to neural networks are really here. And I'll just point out one more obscure one, which is it was a paper in 1985, which was the first Boltzmann machine learning algorithm, was sometimes referred to as Ackley et al. Does anybody remember David Ackley? Okay, where is David Ackley? He's hiding back here. And in front of him is Jonathan Cohen, who is a pioneer in computational psychiatry and is now the co-director of the Neuroscience Institute at Princeton University. And so all these people went off to great careers. And I just want to give one example of someone who I interacted with. This is Charlie Rosenberg. You probably don't know him. He was a co-author on the NetTalk paper. He was a graduate student at Princeton with George Miller, who was a very distinguished cognitive psychologist, psychophysicist. And Charlie and all these younger people here were at institutions where there was no neural networks going on. So they came to the summer school because they wanted to find out what was going on. There were very few papers. There weren't many meetings. And so Charlie came to my lab that summer, and he wanted to work on a problem in linguistics. And so we picked out the problem of text to speech. Right? This is a problem which we thought might be amenable to the small networks at the time. This is a problem that the linguists had studied in great detail. And it was at a time when Jeff visited us and found out with the project and told us that we were crazy, that this would never work, that language is extremely difficult, and the problem of English is particularly difficult when it comes to the letters. Each of them can be pronounced in many different ways, the phonemes, and that we should start with the children's book, which is what we did. And here's the network that we used. Before that, we were very fortunate that Dave Romelhart and Jeff and Ron Williams came up with Backprop, which it turned out to be much, much more efficient, and our project probably wouldn't have been successful without it. But here's the architecture. There's an input layer at the bottom, a window of 7 letters. The middle one is the one you're trying to pronounce, the phoneme attached to it. The other letters are the context. one layer of hidden units. And this, for the time, was actually a giant network. It had 20,000 ways, and it had a couple thousand units. And so we got a children's book, which Jeff suggested, and we turned it on, and of course it memorized 100 words, and that wasn't going to help. Fortunately, we did find other corpuses, and I'll show you one in a minute, but first let me show you, if we can get the audio, what it sounds like at the very beginning when you turn it on and it doesn't know anything, and it's putting out pretty much random pronunciations for each letter, but very quickly picks up on the most important distinction, that between vowels and consonants. Do I hear? Okay, I guess it's not going to work. Okay, we had trouble with the audio earlier, but I can actually, I memorized it. It goes ba ga da 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 ba ga da. Basically, it babbles. And we got hold of a corpus, which was a transcription of a Latino child in Barrio in Los Angeles, and on the left side was the transcription of the words, and on the right side was the actual sounds. And again, after training it overnight, it actually pronounced it in a way that you could understand. And can we give this another try? Audio man? Sorry, I don't see you. What was that? Go for it. Okay. Okay, let's go for it. We were stunned. This shouldn't have worked. We were told by the linguists, in fact, there's a book with 250 pages of rules, and each rule has exceptions, and the exceptions have rules, and there are rules to the exceptions to the rules. It's rules all the way down. And here was this tiny network that had compressed this complexity, both the regularities and the irregularities in the same architecture. And it really was, in a sense, one of the first examples and harbinger of the fact that neural networks love language, it turns out. Not too surprising, because our brains love language too. Shortly thereafter, the PDP books came out. Jeffrey was going to be an author, but he decided instead to focus on the Boltzmann machine. But he has several chapters. But this was really the first textbook that could be used, and it was really focusing on the applications to psychology, to understanding something about cognitive functioning. Now, it did not escape Marvin Minsky's attention that we were disrupting the nice little story that he had, that namely neural networks are a dead end. And so they came out with a new edition, expanded edition, in 1969, that had a 36-page epilogue. And this is an amazing document. You should read it. It's a master piece of rhetoric about how we don't know what we're doing, how it's never going to scale, and forget it, we can't compete. And it was about that time I was asked to get, a little bit later, asked to give a talk at MIT, computer science lab. And they told me they had a tradition. The tradition was that before my talk, there's going to be a lunch discussion with the faculty. And as we're going up the elevator to lunch, and as the door opens, he says, "And they hate what you do." So you can imagine how that discussion went. So neural networks went into a period of, I would say, slow incremental advances. The hoopla had gone away, but progress was made, and in particular, CFAR had a program that was established in 2004, Neural Computation of Active Perception, NCAP, Jeff was the director, Jan was the chair of the advisory board, and I was another member. And this is the group with Yoshua Bengio that created deep learning. I mean, over that 10 years, I saw it built up sequentially through one advance after the next. And probably the biggest boost was when GPUs became available. And it was at 2012, at that time, the meeting formerly known as NIPS, where Jeff gave the talk on ImageNet and showed that in one fell swoop, he was able to, and along with his 2 graduate students, reduce the error by 20%, which is typically 1% per year. There was like 20 years of research, and that really had was an earthquake in terms of the vision community, but on a larger scale, brought us to where we are today. So this is a seminal moment. I've written about this history, and if you're interested, MIT Press came out last year. It's $22 on Amazon, very affordable, but it has a lot more in it than just the history. It has a lot of information about, as you can see in the tagline at the top, this is really what the book's about, artificial intelligence meets human intelligence. That is to say, this is a transformation where we're focused now is no longer on rules or symbols, although they're clearly a part of the goal that we're looking for is to be able to reproduce the human ability to work with abstract concepts. But rather, the idea, though, is to extract these general principles. And in fact, the convolutional neural networks that made possible the AlexNet, as you probably know, really took into account what we knew about the visual system back in the 1960s from Hubel and Wiesel, the convolutions, the pooling, the filters, the pooling, normalization. All of those things are found in the cortex, cerebral cortex. Subsequently, the improvements kept on going by putting in more things that we know about the cortex, namely things like working memory, LSTM, things like attention. And these are all things that psychologists have known for a long time. And as you add these new principles in, performance gets better. As the networks get bigger, performance gets better. And this is what happened during evolution of the human brain. Our cortex, relative to our body size, is much bigger than any primate. And the cortex of primates is much bigger than all the other animals, all the other mammals, which have a neocortex. So this is, more is better. This is something biology discovered a long time ago. Okay, I'm going to change gears now, and I'm going to talk about a project that involves reinforcement learning. And as you know, this is another very, very powerful algorithm that can be used in machine learning. And what you should know is that just as the deep learning is meant to be a model of the cortex, the reinforcement learning algorithm that was developed by Rich Sutton is really a model of the basal ganglia, which receives a direct input from the entire cortex and has a feedback to the cortex. And one of the things, take-homes here, is that as we add more pieces of the brain, it becomes more powerful in terms of the problems you can solve. It's known that the basal ganglia is important for learning sequences of actions to reach a goal. And in temporal difference learning, what Rich Sutton realized is that you can solve dynamic programming problems without having all the data. You can solve it online if you keep track of the value of the state you're in, that you're going to go into, and use what's called reward prediction error. You compare the reward you get from what you expected, and you use that to change the weights in your network, in the cortex. Peter, Diane, and Reed Montague, familiar names, were postdocs in my lab at the time, and we realized that it's the dopamine neurons that were known to be an important part of the reward system. These are in the brainstem, the basement of the brain, that we predicted computing reward prediction error, and this has been confirmed many, many times in monkeys recording single neurons and in humans with functional imaging. Jerry Tesaro used TD Gammon and had a program play itself many times, and in the 80s achieved championship performance. Now, I'm not going to explain how backgammon works. It has an element which makes it difficult. which is that you throw dice, and therefore there's a randomness in it, which means you can't go very many ply in terms of planning like you can in chess. But it turned out that, again, this turned out to be an extremely effective algorithm. In fact, it was really, it did so well, he had no idea how good it was, so he brought in an expert who's from New York City. He was at Thomas J. Watson in New York. And Roberti said, look, this is making moves I've never seen before. He went back and analyzed them, and they were better than moves that he was an expert on board position, better than moves that humans had made on the same position. And of course now, fast forward, this is from the 80s now, we're talking about computers have increased in 2017 by more than 1 million times, and DeepMind, coupling deep learning now with temporal differences and souping that up, we're able to beat the world Go champion. And this was an earthquake, more so in Asia, in China, in Korea, and Japan than here, because it's not a game that's commonly played in the West. But there, Kizhi, who was the world champion at the time, was, very well-known and a rock star in that world. And so here's what he said. After humanity spent thousands of years improving our tactics, computers tell us that humans are completely wrong. Now, why did he say that? He said that because the moves that were made by AlphaGo were so novel that nobody knew how to respond to it. In fact, some cases, you wouldn't figure out why the move was made until many moves later. And with this, why this is important is not just that he learned how to play the game, but it was creative. It came up with creative solutions. This is a case where something we thought was really exclusively human creativity is something that emerged from this interaction between models of two different brain areas. So I teamed up with Massimo Vergasola, who's in the physics department at UC San Diego, and we said, look, let's take this into the real world. Games are great, but they're very constrained in terms of the number of the game board is very deterministic. It's deterministic algorithms that people have used and so forth. But the real world is stochastic and unknown. Let's apply reinforcement learning to a real problem, which is how birds soar. And this is a little clip about how to track. This is a falcon that's being tracked with GPS, and it gives you a hint for how birds discover where there's a thermal rising on air and how they track that up with very, very little energy. They're gliding, basically. There it goes. Okay. Blue is down, yellow is up. There it catches the thermal. It's going up, searching for the center, and there's a horizontal wind, so it's tracking that too. Nobody knows how birds do that. We don't have a clue. We don't know what cues they're using. We don't know what their algorithm is for what to do when temperature changes or the wind changes, but somehow they manage to do it. And there are some birds that can migrate thousands of miles without landing, from the Arctic all the way down, to the North America. And they do it by catching one thermal after the next. Now, this diagram is very misleading. It looks like there's a column of hot air, but nothing could be farther from the truth. It looks more like this. It's chaotic. There are all these vortices and things that are very, very chaotic. So what do thermals really look like? So Massimo Vergasola is an expert at this, and so he simulated using the Rayleigh-Bernard convection equations for U, the vertical velocity, and theta, the temperature. You solve these equations, and this is what you see. On the left is the velocity field. So you can see there's a column of red going up and blue going down, but it's not at all a simple column. It's very, you don't see this, very dynamic in terms of it twists and turns and it's changing all the time. Temperature, as you can see, is hot on the bottom and cold at the top, but you can see there are these fingers up and down. Again, chaos. So again, how does the bird manage this? I mean, this is amazing. The bird's going to integrate all the equations to figure out the physics of thermals. I doubt that. So, to make a long story short, what we did, and I should say we, Gautam Reddy, our graduate student, first simulated temporal difference learning with layers in a deep learning network, and showed that at least in principle, it might be possible with a relatively small number of trials. We can collect a lot of data from all the sensors. So he put together one of these gliders. It's, by the way, this is a hobby. There are clubs. We were lucky because there's one in San Diego that we were able to get a lot of very good advice from, and also they had a launcher, which is a winch that shoots the glider up, and then it's radio controlled. And the goal is to catch a thermal and see how far you can go, how long you can stay up, and how high you can go. So Gautam then basically instrumented it with sensors for velocities, accelerations, angle of attack, everything that we thought might be important. And then he went to Poway, which is a little in the North County, a little bit inland from the coast where we're located. And you can see what it's like. It's unpopulated and perfect conditions for thermals, and this is where he practiced. And so what he did was, for weeks, he would launch his glider, and this is what would happen. It would crash and burn. It starts out at about a few hundred feet, and then it just goes down, down, down. But it kept getting better and better and better. And one day, it went up. And it went up. And, an expert looking at this would say, well, it looks a lot like the way the bird catches the thermal and goes up in a spiral manner, right? So this is really quite remarkable. We're talking here about physics. We're talking here about the real world. We're talking about these uncertainties, okay? So great, we've solved the problem. But we have a very, very, I think, opportunity here, because we can go in, take the network apart, do experiments, and figure out what are the features that were responsible for this behavior, and what is the control law that was used, that was discovered. Well, it was about this time that there was a competition, and Gautam, at this point, was confident, didn't know exactly how, from day to day things were changing. But in any case, everybody was taking their gliders up, and so they Gautam launched his glider and sat down, put down his radio control, and here's what happened. The glider, as you can see, where it started, had a horizontal wind that was very high, but it was looping in. It actually caught the thermal. Here it got a little confused, but it caught another thermal, went up even further. And at this point, everybody is astonished, because not just was it going up farther than any of their gliders, but he was sitting in this chair. And they didn't know what was going on. They knew that he'd been there for several months and was playing with his glider, but they didn't take it very seriously. And then finally, the glider went out of radio control range. It went so high that it broke the bank. Now, here's what we learned from that experiment. Okay, I thought that temperature would be very important. It's a thermal, right? High temperature. Okay, so what we did was, and this is in simulation, we used various features to see which ones were the most important, and temperatures were absolutely useless. It did not help at all, and for reasons that we can only speculate. Too much turbulence, who knows? The two most important features are shown here. There's vertical acceleration, which makes a lot of sense, because if there's a rising column, then you're going to accelerate. But this one here is even more interesting, which is the horizontal gradient of the vertical velocity. That means that your wing is going to tip. So if you're accelerating and your wing tips, that's a good indication, and if you look at the control law, it tells you what you should do. Now, what about some of the other features, right? So if you combine these two, you do as well as you're going to do. If you add temperature, it doesn't help. If you add vertical velocity, it doesn't help. And this surprised us, angle of attack. We thought angle of attack would be important whether you're going down or up. In fact, it did worse. So angle of attack is not useful. So we've identified two features, vertical acceleration and horizontal gradient of the vertical velocity. And this is now something that can be tested in birds. So there are ways of instrumenting birds and seeing, what their acceleration is, and then seeing how they react to it. And so this is going to really be interesting as a way to understand something about birds. Now, all of these are examples of what I said earlier, which is that paying attention to nature is a very good way to get good ideas. Nature spent a lot more time during evolution getting algorithms that worked, implementing them, refining them. Unfortunately, nature didn't tell us what algorithms it chose. So we really need to go and look at, scientifically at the actual behaviors, at the actual mechanisms and so forth. And what we want to extract are more principles that we can take. And one of the most important principles is that unlike deep learning networks that are cobbled with data and hyperparameters, the human brain just is autonomous. It just works away. It just cranks away. And it does. The human brain actually does survive in the real world and reproduces itself and is conscious. So why don't we take a closer look to see how this works? And that's really what the goal of computational neuroscience is. And this illustrates the many different levels where you can look for principles, all the way from synapses up to systems, hierarchy of visual areas, inspired Jan LeCun's deep learning, convolutional networks, filters at the earliest level, simple cells, which we find in the earliest layer of deep learning networks. There's a lot more. There's a lot more that we can learn. And the question is, how are we going to learn it? Well, it's going to require resources. And back in 2013, then President Obama chose the brain as his grand challenge in engineering and science. Kennedy chose the moon, man on the moon. Nixon chose war on cancer. The Human Genome Project is another good example. And these are big projects that really require engineers to work closely with scientists. And the brain is a particularly difficult challenge, in part because of the complexity, but mainly because of the tools that we have, which are very primitive. Most of the work on the visual cortex, for example, was done by recording from one neuron at a time. You can imagine how long it takes to sample all of the neurons. That's a very, very slow process. So the BRAIN initiative that was announced is a $5 billion 10-year program that is now halfway through. And I was on the committee that drew up a report that was used by the director of NIH, which is Francis Collins, who is located right here, to offer them priorities for how the money should be spent. And our highest priority was to get the engineers to collaborate with the biologists. That, the biologists have questions, but they don't know how to build things, and the engineers don't know how to build things. They don't know what the questions are. So during the first 5 years, all of the projects were collaborations between engineers and biologists. And one of the goals of the 7 was to record from more neurons at the same time. And today, this has been spectacularly successful. It's now possible to record from thousands, tens of thousands of neurons from dozens of areas at the same time. And just to bring it home, BRAIN is actually an initiative, an acronym. And so the I and the N are innovative neurotechnologies. So the money went for tools. not trying to solve some difficult medical problem like Alzheimer's disease. There's already billions of dollars going into that. But if we had better tools, we might accelerate the research. That was our goal. So I'm going to end by giving you an example of taking you into the future. What is the future of neuroscience that will help us to build the next generation deep learning system, not just the cortex, but the whole brain? Because ultimately, we need to have a global understanding of behavior. This is the fruit fly, and it's a workhorse for neuroscientists because it has very good genetics, and it's possible to introduce genes, knock out genes. You're able to label single neurons. You're able to use optogenetics to stimulate single neurons. So this is a really wonderful model system. You can see it's tiny, right? The brain is less than a millimeter across. It has about 100,000 neurons. But it's approachable in the sense that you can record from them. And one of the projects now, funded by the Brain Initiative, was to record systematically from all the neurons in the fly brain at the same time, using optogenetics for being able to inject genetic markers for activity. And so what you're seeing here on the right, just to orient you, is a horizontal section through the fly brain. It's about 0.5 millimeter across. And these are two neurons that are uniquely identified. There's unique neurons in the fly brain, unlike the human cortex that has a proliferation of neurons that are similar to each other, not exactly the same. But here, there are unique neurons that are labeled, and here on the left is our extraction of it from activity patterns using independent component analysis, which is an algorithm developed in my lab back in the 1990s. It's basically the cocktail party problem, blind source separation. You give it a lot of microphones with mixtures of signals, and it detects the independent sources that gave rise to those mixtures. And in this case, a bunch of independent neurons that are firing away, and you give the activity pattern, and it separates out each individual neuron. And just, again, to orient you, there are these parts of the fly brain which you'll see. This is the protocerebral bridge. And shown here on the right in colors are the different sectors. And shown on the left are the components. Each color is a different component, showing the discreteness of the structure. This is the ellipsoidal body, again, different colors meaning different components. And this is the fan-shaped body. So we can really dissect out almost every neuron and the activity pattern. I'm going to show you a movie. And this is now looking way into the future, because this movie will illustrate both the opportunities, but also the challenges of trying to figure out what's going on during a behavior. So this is a fly that is sitting on a ball here. You'll see it moving. And we are recording, this is Ralph Greenspan's lab, recording with something called a light microscope that actually records in 3D so you can see the whole depth. And analyzed by Sophie Ayman, who is a joint postdoc in our labs. And you will see on the right the patterns of activity as they come and go. And you'll get a feeling for what we're up against and what those opportunities are. So you can see now it's moving left. And it's circuits in the brain that are important for movement. Now it's grooming. And there are different circuits that are important for grooming. And if you focus here, that's the protocerebral bridge. You can see neurons there are activated. Now it's moving, and you can see activity throughout the whole brain. This is, a large fraction of the neurons are involved in the sensory and the motor process for a fly to be able to activate and the motor system in the right way. And so now we can dissect out every single neuron during complex behaviors. And this can be done not just in flies, it can be done in rodents, it can even be done in monkeys and humans. And this is really just the beginning, because we have the tools now, not just to record from all the neurons, but within the next year, we're going to actually have the complete connectivity using connectomic methods, which, by the way, were made possible by deep learning. The problem is you have electron microscope slices, and you have to reconstruct 3D from that. It's a very difficult problem. It's very difficult even for humans. But we now are on the verge of being able to have a complete wiring diagram. That's by itself, it's not going to tell us a lot, but it's really important as a foundation of where you can interpret the signals and how the neurons are connected with each other. And the other thing you can do is, with deep learning is analyze the behaviors. Those complex behaviors can be analyzed and related to the actual neural patterns. And I just want to give you one really interesting paper that came out in Science earlier this spring. It was at UC London, and this is Matteo Carandini and Ken Harris. What they did was to record using neuropixels, these are big arrays of electrodes, from 20,000 neurons in the mouse brain, all over 24 areas. And at the same time, they took video of the snout. Now, it was head fixed, but it was awake and behaving. The whiskers are going back and forth. The snout is going up and down. It's breathing. There's a lot of motion in that face. So what they did was they analyzed the video. They looked at the recording, and they showed that just by looking at the spontaneous activity, now this is not a task. The mouse is just sitting there, but there's enough information in the activity, the spontaneous activity in those areas, so you can predict 80% of the variance of the motions of the snout of the mouse. And you can do it backwards. You can take the motion and predict the activity patterns. So this is actually telling us something that surprised a lot of us, including me. Everybody thought spontaneous activity was noise. It's just the background, and they subtract it off. No, the spontaneous activity is a very rich source of information about the behavioral state of the animal, and not just the skeletal muscles, but also internal organs. They're represented in the brain, too. So this is really a completely new way of looking at the global pattern of activity, and this is just beginning. Now, I want to end with a tribute to Jeff. And you probably know that George Boole is Jeff's great-great-grandfather. And I think, what a heritage. And I once picked up this book to see, everybody knows that Boolean logic, which is really the theory behind digital computers, really came from his mathematical work that was published back in 1854. So I took a look at the book, and then here's the title. It says, An Investigation of the Laws of Thought. So he was already thinking about, AI, even though he might not have known that. Back then they didn't know artificial intelligence was possible, on which are founded the mathematical theories of logic. And here is where I was totally amazed. And probabilities. And so I opened the book, and sure enough, at the very end, there's a section, about a third of the book, where he says, well, the problems, real problems that we have to deal with in thought have to do with assessing probabilities and weighing them and so forth. And it was clear that he understood the real issues that were involved. You need to have both of these as part of your theory. And I think it's really wonderful that a progeny of George Boole would have actually made progress with the probability side of that equation. And I think if George Boole were alive today, I think he'd be very, very proud of Jeff, and I am too. And thank you.